Okay, so we got Carb back on the workbench, and I'm going to remove this screw right here, and then this arm, we're going to pull it straight out, and then we should be able to get this piston, which goes down to the throttle valve. Okay, so once you get your set screw off of that arm right there, you guys are going to want to come over here and forget about all of this. You guys are just going to want to pull straight out on this. Now there is a spring connecting it, so what you guys can do is get a little screwdriver just like that, push down, pull back on your spring, and then this should pop right out. Now that spring is under tension, right, because that's your throttle return spring. So when you go to put this back together, all you want to do is grab that spring, because it'll be somewhere up here. You can pull it back around, and then that just clips on to the arm right there. But you guys should be able to pull this straight out just like that. Okay, now we're going to be able to pull this arm and our throttle piston straight out. Just remember that there is a little Teflon washer, and that goes on that side of that arm. Okay, now this is the tricky part. To get at this metering rod here, we're going to have to take out these two little Phillips screws that hold it into place. So what you're going to want to do is move this arm to one side and get the one out, and then you should be able to disconnect this and the metering rod from this piston. Now that is called a throttle piston valve. So this slides up and down in your carburetor, and again, this metering rod goes through your main jet. So because this is a tapered rod and this goes into your main jet, the farther up that we have this means the more fuel that we can get through our main jet. So what we're going to do is, once we get this off, we're going to move the clip down one notch, and that'll bring this metering rod up just a little bit, and that should solve all our problems. And once you use your Phillips screwdriver to get your little Phillips screw out of there, we now have access to our clip that goes on top of our metering rod. So we're going to push this right out, put it onto our workbench. The manufacturers set this at the second slot, which you guys can see right there. So we got the slot at the top and then one down. What we're going to be doing is putting it to the third, just one down, that's all. Okay, now just a little piece of advice, guys. When you're popping that clip off, just make sure you put your thumb over it, or maybe even a cloth, because that thing, you know, it's under quite a bit of pressure, and once you pop that off, you don't want it to fly across your shop. So again, we're going to move it one slot down, and that should solve our issues. I'm going to go ahead and put all this back together the same way I took it apart. Okay, now putting this thing back together, what you're going to want to do is snug up one of your Phillips bolts just to the point where you can still rotate this thing. So you guys can see the other hole down there, we're not lined up. So again, you don't want to tighten that thing up. You just want to snug the one up, so then you could flip this just enough so you could still rotate this thing into position for the other one. And then once you get the second one in, you can go ahead and tighten them both up. And here's a cool little trick, because you got to get that little screw in there. The first one was easy, but the second one proving to be a little more difficult. If your screwdriver is not magnetized, you guys can actually pick up one of these guys. I got it at Princess Auto, and with a few quick swipes of our screwdriver through the magnetized section, it magnetizes your screwdriver. So you guys can see, now it'll hold on to our screw a little bit easier, so I can drop it inside of the hole there, and hopefully it'll go right in. And then afterwards, you just give it a few swipes through the demagnetize, gradually getting higher and higher as you go, and it'll demagnetize your screwdriver. Okay, so we slipped our piston valve back inside of our carburetor here, but before we get any farther, we're going to have to slide this washer right inside of there, and then go ahead and get your arm right there and slide that through. We'll hook up the spring after. So it should look a little something like that. And then again, now we're going to hook this spring onto this little arm right there. Just make sure that your spring on the other side is hooked up to that little aluminum post there. Okay, and before you go any farther, just double check that your throttle return spring snaps back like it should. So now we're ready to put our set screw back in. And I've also taken off the sediment bowl one last time just to you know, do a final inspection here. So I'm going to disassemble everything again, and I'm going to try to keep everything clean. So I'm going to put down a little piece of paper towel and keep everything as clean as I can. But again, I just want to go and check these jets just to make sure that everything is clean. I'll blow them out with a compressor, maybe get my oxyacetylene tip cleaner again just to poke them through, just to make sure 100% that we didn't pick up a little piece of gunk that was left behind, maybe in the fuel line or you know, somewhere else, maybe from the air filter or something like that. Okay, so I got this thing all back together now. I skipped ahead because you guys have already seen me put it back together once before, so I wiped out the air box. There was a little bit of oil and a little bit of gasoline in there, so I just got to reinstall the air filter. Pretty simple. You just pop that on, and then this little guy up here bolts there with a little Phillips screw. I'll get the fuel line hooked up, and then we're going to fire this thing up, and it's going to purr like a kitten. That's the plan anyways. Okay, moment of truth. See if she fires. Okay, so that's awesome. When I get on the throttle, you guys can see revs up nicely. Great throttle response. That's what we wanted. So I'm super happy. So now I just got to turn up that idle, and this thing should idle perfectly. So once again, I'm going to come down here, tighten this up just a little bit. I should do it while it's running, but I just want to do it so that I can fire this thing up, put the camera down, and you know, let her run, and then adjust it while it's running. Purrs like a kitten. So there you have it, guys. I just had to adjust that metering rod, and the thing idles perfect now. And it's got good throttle response too. No backfiring. This thing's gonna have way more power than it did before. Okay, so to change the oil on this thing, we're gonna warm it up, and we're gonna open up the dipstick right here. Then we're gonna come underneath the machine, and we're gonna be going to this bolt right there. That's the oil drain plug. Okay, so I'm ready to change the oil on this. I've warmed up the machine. I've come over here and opened up the dipstick just to allow some ventilation through so it doesn't get vapor locked. I have my oil drain pan underneath the engine here, and using a 17mm socket, I was able to loosen up that drain plug at the bottom of the engine that I showed you. So now I'm going to take it off just by hand, and we'll get this oil drained. So I'm going to let this sit for a little bit, drain as much out as I can, maybe run a little bit through the dipstick opening there, just to flush out anything that might be in the bottom of the oil pan here. Then once we have some clean oil coming out, I'll reinstall that oil drain plug at the bottom, and we'll go ahead and get some fresh oil in this thing. So when adding oil to this machine, you want to make sure that your oil is in between these two lines right here. So that's your low, that's your high. You don't want it going above that. And when you're checking your oil level after you've put some in, the manual recommends that you want to dip it. So this is called dipping it. You're not screwing in the threads of the dipstick. You're just dipping it in, pulling it out, and then you're going to check that oil level. Other machines, they might say to screw it in and then screw it out and check it that way. But on this ATC250, we're just going to be dipping it in, pulling it out, and then you're going to check that oil level. And that's it, guys. Pretty simple. We're also going to be changing the oil filter on this machine. So before we do that, we're going to have to take off the oil filter cover using an 8mm socket. So we got our new oil filter here. You guys can see one side has a rubber seal, the other side doesn't. So right here on the little pamphlet they give you, basically they show you how to do it. The spring goes first, then the oil filter with the rubber seal towards the outside, and then your cover. Pretty simple stuff. Now I have my drain pan set up underneath because things might get a little messy, so you're going to want to have a couple rags handy that you can put up under here while you go and pull this cover off, and then get the old oil filter out of there. Like I said, once you get that cover off, things are going to get a little messy, so you're going to want to have a couple rags handy to wipe all the old oil off. Okay, so this is the tricky part. You're going to have to get your filter and your spring, and when you go to put it in, you're going to have to get the spring inside these little 4 tabs there, and that'll hold it into place. Then you should be able to put your cover on and everything just in one foul swoop. Try to center it up best you can, but you don't want that spring to fall out. And before I put this filter in, I'm going to be pre-soaking it, so I'm going to put a little bit of fresh oil onto it, just so that once we do get the oil in there, the filter won't absorb that oil, and then we'll show a low reading on our dipstick. So by pre-soaking it, it'll prevent this from happening. Okay, and like I said, we're going to be doing this in one foul swoop, so I'm going to put it in, and then all at once, push that in, get a couple bolts in, and then we'll go ahead and fill this thing up with oil. Now at this point, it actually helps to get a jack and jack up your machine, because what'll end up happening is when this thing's flat and level, your spring's gonna wanna fall out. But if you jack it up on an angle like I got, and you get it just in the right spot, you can actually get the spring to stay in there, and then you could go ahead and put your cover and your filter on in one foul swoop without that spring falling out of there. Okay, so we're ready to put some oil into this. We're going to be using premium 10W40. This is Pro Honda oil, and it says here in the bottle there's 3.785, so just about 3.8 liters. I've got my jack set up just so I can get a funnel in here, so it's a little bit easier. If you're going to be using a funnel, make sure it's clean, so I've wiped that out. The manual calls for 2.5 liters of oil. We're going to be starting with just about 2, and then I'll level this out, and then we'll check it regularly as we add slowly. Because you guys got to remember, it's always going to be easier to add oil than it is to, you know, drop the machine down again, open up the drain plug, and then drain a whole bunch of oil out, and then have to add even more after. So start slow till the point where you're right in between those 2 lines that I showed you, then you'll be good to go. Okay, so I got the 3-wheeler leveled now. We're going to pull this out again. Don't screw it in, we're just going to be dipping it. And you guys can see we're just starting to get over that top mark. So I'm going to add a little bit more oil, and then we'll check it again. Okay, so I'm right at the spot that I want to be right about now. We're about 3/4 of the way up there, you guys can see. So what I'm going to do now is put this dipstick back in. We're going to fire this up. We're going to let it run for a little bit. Let that oil circulate. Let it circulate back through the oil filter here, because again, you know, when we pulled that off, you're going to have oil that stays up here. So after we let it run a little bit, that level might lower just a little bit, and then we'll check it again. Okay, so after running it for a little bit, I can see that we've gone down just a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit more oil, just a little bit, just until we get closer to that top line there. Okay, and right about there is pretty good, guys. We're just about at the full line here, so that's it for the oil change. Well, that's it for part 3. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You can click over here to subscribe, and you can click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every week, so be sure to come on back and check out what we got new on the channel next week. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.